Whip for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP Liberal government continues to ram through legislation that has criminals jumping for joy. Criminals who steal people's wallets at gunpoint, shoot up the neighborhood, traffic in weapons, or use a gun in their other criminal activities are one step closer to reduced sentences. Now, they claim it's to address overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous peoples in the correction system, but they ignore that these same communities are the ones most often victimized by gun crime. How is it that this government lacks so much compassion for victims and people at risk of violent crime?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, our government is moving forward to make the criminal justice system safer for communities, make it better for victims, make it much more fair and just. What we're doing with Bill C-5, Mr. Speaker, is attacking overrepresentation in the criminal justice system of Black and Indigenous peoples by taking those offenders, Mr. Speaker, who do not pose a risk for public security and making conditional sentence orders available to more crimes, and by reducing around 20 minimum mandatory penalties. Mr. Speaker, we're also raising the sentences for serious crimes.
The Honourable Whip for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I hear from my constituents that their faith in the justice system is absolutely shaken. Rural communities repeatedly targeted by repeat offenders want serious action. Instead, the government is going to let the people that are beating, robbing, and shooting at them stay out of jail for these and even more serious offences. This will make things worse. This government's justice reforms fail to address overrepresentation of minority groups in the prison system, and it also fails to enhance public safety. So why doesn't the government do something useful instead of just virtue signaling all the time?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth than what the honourable member is saying. Bill C-21, Mr. Speaker, attacks violent crime, attacks gang crime, attacks trafficking in arms, and raises the maximum penalties available for certain sentences. Mr. Speaker, if he's talking about repeat offenders, those offenders do not have access to minimum mandatory penalties. In fact, they go the other way, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, public safety is not going to be negatively affected. In fact, it's going to be enhanced by allowing for serious offences to be treated seriously and for more flexibility at the other.
The Honourable Opposition House. Lewin.
Well, since the Liberals like importing American policies so much, in the 1990s, the United States experimented with a tax on boats very similar to the one in this year's Liberal budget, but Congress ended up removing it just 2 years later because it was killing jobs and destroying the industry. It was so bad that the government ended up losing more money from the industry collapse than it generated from revenue. It was a net loss for the Treasury. Will the Liberals admit that there's absolutely no point in having this tax that will cost jobs and kill a sector of our economy that Canadian families enjoy? Or is that their plan? Is that their plan?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it comes as no surprise that this question is coming from the Conservative Party. They voted against increasing taxes for the 1% and decreasing taxes for the middle class. With respect to jobs, Mr. Speaker, that the member raises, Statistics Canada released a report today indicating that May saw 400,000 new jobs created in this country. These are full-time jobs that are well-paying, Mr. Speaker. Since last year, we see an increase in wages of nearly 4%. Canadians are taking home bigger paychecks thanks to the policies that our Liberal government put in place.
Speaker, my constituents have never seen grocery prices so high thanks to Made in Canada inflation. One response to my recent grocery survey read, quote, "I'm a 79-year-old widow on pension. My food and rent have gone sky high," unquote. As well, a recent online Castanet poll found almost 80% of respondents saying rising prices force them to cut back on what they buy. The Liberals can't keep blaming everyone else on food inflation. Is the government going to do anything to help cut the rising price of food? And if not, why?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, there are a number of measures that our government put in place that will help Canadians this year. Canadian families will be receiving up to $7,000 this year in the Canada Child Benefit, and checks are starting to come out in July. Over 3 million Canadian workers are going to benefit from the Canadian Workers Program. But, Mr. Speaker, what we hear from the other side, from the Conservatives, are two policy proposals this week. One is to give a tax break to big oil and gas, and the second is to give a break to Russia and drop the sanctions against Russia. Mr. Speaker, there is no solid, credible economic policy coming from the Conservative Party, and it's disappointing.
The honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Just to correct the record, we are asking for assistance to consumers, so I just want to get that on the record. Statistics Canada reported that 75% of Canadians are being impacted negatively by ever-increasing cost of living. Food costs up. Housing costs up, fuel is up. But when this government has the opportunity to provide relief from the pumps, they turn them down. Where is the help from this government for Canadians who are struggling with the dramatic increase in cost of living today?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are proposing to give a tax break to oil and gas companies, not to Canadians. Mr. Speaker, we are providing direct payments to Canadians. Canadians who have trouble finding affordable housing will be getting a direct payment from our government. Canadians who are working at minimum wage will be getting a direct payment from our government. We are helping Canadians directly, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do that.
The honourable member for North Okanagan-Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, sky-high inflation, now at a 31-year high, is having a disproportionate impact on Canadians. The PM doesn't have to buy groceries or fill his own tank, but Canadians on lower incomes are spending a disproportionately higher percentage of their incomes on necessities like bread, milk, and sundries. Gas prices in the North Okanagan-Shuswap are at $2.13 a litre. Some can't afford to drive to work. We know the Prime Minister does not think about monetary policy for Canadians, but do any of the other SPEND-EP Liberals think about it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite cites the PBO report. The PBO report also confirms that inflation is a global phenomenon caused by the war in Ukraine and caused by bottlenecks in supply chains from the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, what we've done is put forward a number of measures in the budget that will help Canadians directly. What the Conservatives have done is to delay the implementation of the budget, delay funding going straight to Canadians in order to help them with the cost of living increase, Mr. Speaker, and it's shameful.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
The Prime Minister keeps saying that the government took on debt during the pandemic so that Canadians wouldn't have to. Well, it turns out it just didn't work. Now the Bank of Canada reports that Canadians' biggest vulnerability is higher household indebtedness. In fact, interest rates are on the rise and people are at risk of losing their homes. And so this is a very important question, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister finally admit that this government's irresponsible spending led to this cost of living crisis? Isn't that right, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, a report just came out this week indicating that Canadians and investors have an extremely high confidence in the Bank of Canada and all of our financial institutions. That's certainly not thanks to the member of Carleton's comments or the Conservatives' comments impugning the independence of the Bank of Canada. We will do everything to ensure that our Canadian economy continues to grow. Experts are forecasting that the economy here in Canada will grow at a higher rate than the rest of G7 countries both this year and next year. Our Stats Canada numbers from this morning indicate that unemployment is at its lowest levels historically in this country, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to be focused on our economy and on Canadians.
The honourable member for Langley Aldergrove.
At $2.36 a litre, the price of gasoline in BC's Lower Mainland is the highest in North America. Now, we hear the Minister of Finance say that the price of gasoline is beyond her control, yet we know that it is this government's policy to actually drive up the cost of gasoline. When will they come clean and acknowledge that their policies are hurting ordinary Canadians and fueling our cost of living crisis?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the only proposal from the Conservative Party is to cut taxes on the oil and gas companies themselves, with no guarantee that those tax cuts will be passed on to consumers, Mr. Speaker. What we are doing is providing direct support to Canadians in order so that they can meet the increased cost of living that they're seeing as a result of the war in Ukraine, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to be focused on Canadians themselves and not big oil.
The honourable member for Desnette Mississippi, Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, input costs for farmers have soared. Fertilizer costs have nearly tripled and fuel costs have doubled, all while we face a food security crisis. Yet Liberals intentionally hurt farmers' ability to increase production. A punitive fertilizer reduction policy not based on fact or science and a carbon tax increase, hindering investment in climate-resilient techniques farmers were making long before Liberal ministers were Greenpeace activists. That's right. Mr. Speaker, has the Minister of Agriculture misunderstood that she is supposed to fight for farmers instead of against?
The
Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, once again, I want to reassure my colleague. This government has supported farmers the most.
Budget for the Agricultural Department last year of more than $4 billion. It did not happen with the previous government. I can assure you that, because they have cut budget of the business risk management programs and many other programs. While we have increased the budget for business risk management program, we have invested. We are at $1.5 billion investment in agri-environmental programming. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are experiencing economic challenges that they haven't seen since Pierre Elliott Trudeau was Prime Minister. They are struggling through a cost of living crisis. Inflation is at 6.8%. Supply chain disruption have Canadians waiting for months for essential items. Gas prices over $2 a litre. A struggling stock market has Canadians' retirement savings disappear. Mr. Speaker, are we experiencing a return to Trudeaunomics, or is this just inflation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite cites a few statistics, and I'll do the same. This morning, Statistics Canada confirmed that wages increased for Canadian workers at the highest rate since 1981 by nearly 4%. Canadians are taking home more money in order to meet the cost of living crisis that they are facing, and our government is supporting vulnerable Canadians. In respect of seniors, for example, we increased our supports for seniors, and it's helped lift over 450,000 seniors out of poverty, Mr. Speaker. We are helping 900,000 seniors right now with our increased support.
Come on. The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Speaker, on the question about inflation, the government just shrugs its shoulders and says it's part of a global phenomenon. And it's true that some other countries that are running huge deficits are experiencing inflation, but Canada is the only one deliberately making things worse by increasing taxes on consumers. Dropping the carbon tax and GST on fuel would immediately reduce consumer prices, just like prices dropped in Alberta when the provincial government cut its fuel tax. Why won't this government drop these taxes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's the NDP proposing to increase taxes on oil and gas companies, and it's the Conservative Party that's proposing to cut taxes on oil and gas companies. We're focused on Canadians. We're focused on supporting vulnerable Canadians.
Well, let's take a. As much as I enjoy a go between the two parties, when we're calling somebody a specific liar or what have you is unparliamentary. So if we could just sort of retract that one and then we can move on with question period. Is that okay?
It's okay.
It's okay. Everybody's good. All right. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, we are focused on supporting Canadians directly. That's why this year Canadian families will receive up to $7,000 in the Canada Child Benefit. That's why our new Canadian Workers Program will support over 3 million workers with an increased top-up. Mr. Speaker, we also have direct payments going to Canadians who have trouble finding affordable housing. We are there to support Canadians directly.
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians need this government to listen. Mark works in rural areas in my riding and needs to get to work. Because of distance and terrain, he can't take a bike, there are no buses or trains, he needs to drive a pickup truck. Mark pays $139 for only half a tank of gas. Mr. Speaker, why is this NDP Liberal government not cancelling the carbon tax increase, suspending the GST on gas to give Mark and all other Canadians a break on fuel?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, this week the Conservatives proposed a number of economic policies. One of them was in order to cancel our price on pollution. A price on pollution, we know, is the most effective way to tackle climate change. The other was to give oil and gas companies a break by dropping the GST. The GST works in this country in the following way. The government taxes the oil and gas companies, and the oil and gas companies pass that tax on to consumers. If we drop the GST on oil and gas companies, there's absolutely no guarantee that Canadian consumers will see any benefit at the pumps. It is a tax reduction on oil and gas companies, pure and simple.
Rachel, have you ever bought anything in the store?
You ever paid GST?
It's Friday. The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, Edmonton's food bank is facing record demand. At the same time, they're facing a 30% increase in operating costs due to runaway Liberal gas inflation. Now, these are resources being taken directly away from the people they are trying to help. Now, Edmonton charities need help, and the Liberals can help immediately by reducing gas taxes and suspending the carbon tax. So will the Liberals commit to helping those in need, or do they think perhaps the food bank should feed the needy with dishonest Liberal talking points?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we have been there for Canadians throughout the pandemic. We have increased regularly our supports to food banks, and we have helped lift over 400,000 children in poverty out of poverty, Mr. Speaker. Our programs are supporting vulnerable Canadians every day. This year alone, we have ensured that the Canada Child Benefit will increase up to $7,000 for a Canadian family. This is direct support to Canadians when Canadians need it.
Absolutely.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that the vaccine requirements for being on planes and at workplaces at the moment, I don't think the benefits of these mandates warrant the cost. That statement was from the Liberal member from Thunder Bay, Rainy River, who's also a medical doctor and a member of our health committee. In fact, he's been reported that a massive majority of the Liberal caucus want to see an end to these mandates. So I know the Prime Minister won't listen to Conservatives, but will he take the advice of one of the doctors in his caucus and end these vindictive mandates?
Yep, great question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, our government will continue to make sure that we're putting the health of Canadians first, because nobody wants another wave or more lockdowns due to COVID-19. Let's talk about what some of the Conservatives are saying about vaccination. The member from Yorkton Melville claims that the government has a secret agenda and some kind of conspiracy as she refuses to get vaccinated. Another Conservative, the member from Niagara West, wants to ban all mRNA vaccines, the same ones that have saved millions of lives worldwide. This type of rhetoric is divisive and misleading, and all members of this House should stop trying to spread misinformation. We all have an obligation to stand up for Canadians, ensure they continue to be safe.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What Canadians just witnessed right there, that was just spin doctoring and political science, not medical science. It's been reported that a massive majority of the Liberal caucus want to see an end to these mandates. This week, the member from Milton asked my colleague, a medical doctor who ran a COVID-19 ward in Nova Scotia, to stop asking and talking about mandates. On this side of the House, Conservatives will not be intimidated by members opposite. When will we see an end to these vindictive vaccine mandates?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, back in 2020, the Conservatives claimed that we wouldn't have enough vaccines for all Canadians. But let me be clear, Canada has sufficient supply and will ensure that all eligible Canadians are protected for primary series, for boosters, as well as for pediatrics and other therapeutics. In the face of Omicron and other unfortunate variants, Canada will be able to onboard more sufficient supply of both pediatrics and boosters for the provinces and territories to expedite simultaneous vaccine campaigns. Mr. Speaker, this isn't political science. This is the science of supporting our neighbours.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians have had enough of the Liberals' unscientific vaccine mandates. So too, reportedly, have the vast majority of backbench Liberal MPs, including medical doctors. One of these medical doctors, the Liberal member for Thunder Bay Atikokan, has even gone on the public record calling for their immediate end. So, when will the Liberals finally listen to experts within their own caucus, medical doctors, and end the mandates?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to keep Canadians safe, our government has put in place emergency border measures, which have been very effective in reducing the risk of importation and transmission of COVID-19. While COVID-19 cases in Canada have peaked, other countries are having resurgences of cases, and we need to remain vigilant. That's why we've extended Canada's existing border measures until June 30th, 2022, but I would indicate to the member opposite that they have changed over the period of time since November of 2021 that they have been in place. As we said all along, Mr. Speaker, Canada's border measures will remain flexible and adaptable, guided by science and prudence.
Member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Mr. Speaker, my office continues to receive on a daily basis emails and letters from my constituents expressing their frustrations with the ongoing reduced hours at land border crossings. Back in April, I asked the Parliamentary Secretary for Public Safety when the hours would go back to normal. Not only did she not provide an answer to that question, she also fully admitted that she wasn't even listening when I asked it. When will the minister actually take this issue seriously and commit to returning border crossing hours back to normal? Or are they just waiting for the House to recess to avoid giving us credit and hearing, "We told you so"?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're working closely with the CBSA to reopen land ports as quickly as possible. We know it impacts Canadians, especially those exporting commercial goods, which is why we've opened 39 land ports. We continue to open all ports that were temporarily closed from COVID. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rimouskine, Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, the neoliberal government's philosophy on crime will hurt Canadians more than it helps them. Legislation like Bill C-5 will do nothing to deter criminal activity. It will only promote it. The Prime Minister does not realise that victims of violent crime are overrepresented in Black and Indigenous populations. Over the past 7 years, crime has only increased under this government. When will the Minister realise that this type of legislation will do more harm and abolish C-5? The Honourable Minister for Justice. Mr. Speaker, C-5, Bill C-5, targets overrepresented populations in our criminal system, Black and Indigenous populations notably, by giving more flexibility to judges and justices to hand down a sentence, an adequate sentence. Mr. Speaker, we will support victims. We are currently supporting victims, and serious offences will always have serious consequences. We need to tackle the issue of overrepresentation, and that is exactly what we're doing. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, it is urgent that the government wake up. Canadians are being penalised with punitive fines and quarantines for not filling out their ArriveCAN application correctly. Most of them are vaccinated. It's ridiculous. The 14-day quarantine imposed on vaccinated Canadians who do not have the application is now longer than the quarantine imposed on those who actually get COVID-19. For a government that says it follows science, will the Minister finally abandon the ArriveCAN app? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Continues to be an essential and intuitive tool to protect Canadians as we reopen borders and fire up the economy. Through the app, we've streamlined the reopening process, and travel is up 707% from peak pandemic as a result. ArriveCAN takes only a few minutes for vaccinated travelers to complete, and over 99% of air and marine travelers and 94% of land travelers have been compliant and allowed for increased efficiency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Beauce. Well, that's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. The passport saga continues. The government uses the same arguments, but the problems remain the same. Constituents in my riding cannot get Service Canada on the phone, and the lineups are going around the block. Emergency passport applications cannot even be dealt with anymore. Some constituents have even been told to drive 3.5 hours to another riding to try to renew their passport. Is the government's plan to sit on their hands until June 23rd and then magically disappear for their holidays?
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, after 2 years, unfortunately, there were passports that were not being renewed. It means that 2 years' worth of passports have to be processed in mere months. And of course, we didn't know exactly when those volumes were going to be hitting. And that's why we've seen worldwide delays in passports, with jurisdictions in every part of the world struggling to keep up with demand. Obviously, we've increased resources and staff and hours, and we're cutting through that volume. We're pleased to say that we're making good progress, and we want to ensure that Canadians will get their passports as soon as possible.